Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the Rise of Remote series event by the Economic Innovation Group in partnership with Upwork. We are just going to give attendees 1 minute, and then we will get started. All right. Hello again, and welcome to the third and final event in the Economic Innovation Group's Rise of Remote series in partnership with Upwork. I'm Melissa Kosick, the Chief of Staff at EIG, and I want to thank you all so much for being here with us today as we explore trends in remote work post-pandemic. For those of you that have tuned in to the entire series, we appreciate you following along. In the first session of our series, we explored ways to harness the rise of remote work to advance a more equitable geography in the US. In our second session in the Rise of Remote series, we discussed how we can leverage public policy to smooth the transition for businesses, workers, and the US economy. And now in our third and final session in the Rise of Remote series, we're going to do a deep dive into how the remote work revolution can be harnessed to boost entrepreneurship across the country and help to reinvigorate US economic dynamism. We are going to get started with a moderated conversation between Steve Case, the chairman and CEO of Revolution and co-founder of AOL, in a pre-recorded conversation with Kim Hart of Axios. Then we're going to transition to the live panel portion of the webinar with guest speakers Chris Stanton of Harvard Business School, Gretta Corporaal of the University of Oxford, Joe Golden of Collage.com, Kim-Mai Cutler of Initialized Capital, and we'll have Adam Ozimek of Upwork moderating that conversation. We hope to have a couple of minutes towards the end of the webinar for our live panel to answer audience questions, so please submit those in the Q&A function throughout the event as you have them. This webinar is being recorded and we'll post the recording on our website afterward. You can also view the first and second events in the series there as well. And so without further ado, we'll get started by hearing from Steve Case and Kim Hart.
Thank you so much for having us as part of the event today. We'll dive right in. Steve Case, nice to see you. Thanks for being here.
Good to be with you again, Kim. Here we go again.
Here we go. And so you and I have talked a lot over the years about the importance of drawing attention to some of the left behind regions of the country, as we've seen a brain drain of sorts from a lot of cities to the coasts, particularly Texas and Massachusetts and California, which is where a lot of the tech specifically jobs are and have been and have kind of grown up as part of the ecosystem. Now that we're in this new remote world, this grand experiment with remote work during the pandemic, how are you seeing that impact how entrepreneurs are thinking about the location that they choose to live and potentially start companies?
Well, we've been talking about for years. At some point, we thought there would be a boomerang of talent, of people who left some of those places because there wasn't much of an opportunity there, particularly if they wanted to be part of the tech sector, part of the innovation economy, which is why they went to the coast. At some point, there'd be a boomerang of people returning, in part because of the benefits of some of those cities, and particularly around the internet's third wave, where there's some domain expertise in a lot of those cities. And what we've seen with the pandemic, obviously, there have been a lot of tragic aspects to it. I don't want to make light of that, but one of the silver linings is it did become sort of a shake the snow globe moment for a lot of people, and they're reassessing, where they want to live, where they want to work, how they want to live, how they want to work. And open their minds to the idea of maybe it's not in one of the superstar cities like San Francisco or New York or Boston. So I think it's going to end up being something we look back on as one of the things that really created this transformational moment where this rise of the rest dynamic really accelerated, and we saw an acceleration of the dispersion, or maybe the redispersion of talent, and also more venture capital backing more entrepreneurs in more places. So I'm optimistic about what we've seen so far. Obviously, it's still early, it's still more anecdotal, but I suspect over the next 5 or 10 years, we'll look back and this will be an important tipping point moment.
And as people leave superstar cities like even Seattle or San Francisco and New York and Boston, as you said, what are some of the things that you're seeing municipalities, smaller and mid-sized cities do to market themselves better? Are they seeing this as an opportunity to show off what they have, what assets, what amenities they can bring to the table to attract some of these people who had maybe never considered them as options before?
I think we've spent a lot of time in the last few years with mayors, including just a month or so ago, about 60 different mayors. And I think more and more people realize that their core economic development strategy couldn't just focus on existing businesses and luring them to open a new office or customer service center or factory, or maybe even shift their headquarters. They had to focus on new business, on startups. And that mentality has been building over the last really decade, but it has accelerated because of the pandemic. And exactly what you're saying, there are a bunch of mayors and cities that really are using this as a moment to tell their story, to try to be a magnet for talent, a magnet for capital, and are seeing the benefits of that. I think the real work lies ahead, though. How do you make sure that people who are coming feel welcomed, and there's not an us and them dynamic in some of these cities? How do you make sure you do have a great school system and a broad array of jobs, so that it can be a family decision, not just a one-person decision? But I think I've been impressed by some of the things we've seen just over the past 6 or 12 months in terms of mayors and governors and others recognizing this is a moment and really trying to seize it.
And you and I have talked about, and you've talked about this on your Rise of the Rest tours too, is just the amount of time that it takes for a city to gain the critical mass of the expertise and the type of talent that they need, just the mood, the culture of a city that needs to kind of shift. And when we look at a city like Austin, it took more than a decade, probably 2 decades, to really become a tech hub as it is now, and has really benefited from, some of the migration that we've seen during this past year or so. How long do you think that what we're seeing now with this kind of shake the snow globe moment, as you call it, is that accelerating the time frame that can make it possible for a city to reach that kind of status?
Well, just as you see with companies, there is an increasing returns, momentum begets momentum dynamic with cities. So if you plant that flag early and they're working on it for a number of years, in some cases decades, you're the ones who are the beneficiaries now. As you mentioned, Austin, Seattle, Los Angeles, cities like that are benefiting from that acceleration. If you hadn't done as much and just got going more recently, it's going to take longer. But there are already things happening in most of these cities, because you've been with us on these bus tours now. We've done bus tours to 43 cities. Our Rise the Rest Fund has invested in entrepreneurs in over 80 different cities. And there are interesting things bubbling in all these cities, but clearly the ones who've been at this for a longer period of time have really created that broader commitment to a startup community in their city. Those are the initial beneficiaries. And I continue to believe there is value in clustering talent. And that's why cities still do matter. But the argument that we've been making for a while, I think, is becoming more clear. It doesn't just have to be a few superstar cities. It can be dozens of cities. And the other aspect of this pandemic and a movement to either hybrid work or remote work, clearly there are opportunities for folks in smaller cities, even rural communities, that could, particularly if they have better broadband, which Congress is working on, attract people that do want to work remotely all the time. You don't really require the clustering there. You do require the clustering in terms of building startup communities. But I think the biggest question I get is, okay, you've visited all these cities, you've invested in all these cities, what are going to be the top 3 cities? And I always duck the question for 2 reasons. One is kind of like asking who your favorite child is. It's generally not a good idea to answer that question. But the other is, I actually really do believe it's going to be dozens of cities that benefit from this Rise the Rest phenomenon, not just a few. And that's going to be, I think, the story of our innovation economy over the next 10 or 20 years. And even some of the work Congress is now focused on, such as the Endless Frontiers Act, that's now been packaged with a broader innovation competition legislation, would create about 18 tech hubs, more capital going into those hubs. I think people are going to really look back 10, 20, 30 years from now and conclude that this really was a moment where we went from an innovation economy that was limited to a few places, particularly Silicon Valley, to something that was much more diverse, much more broad-based. And I think it'd be great for the innovation economy. Also, it would be great for the country.
You just completed a talent tour as well, where you kind of highlighted some of the job openings available in cities that are often overlooked in job searches, or in places that a lot of tech workers or any workers may just not have associated with being kind of flush with jobs. What were some of the takeaways from that tour?
People are on the move. People are starting to think, different things than they were just 2 years ago. Before, they felt like they had to be in one of these superstar cities to be able to be part of this innovation economy. Now, because some of the large companies in those cities are offering flexibility regarding remote work, and also because they are seeing more and more breakout companies in cities all across the country, they're now open to the idea of moving. The problem is they don't necessarily know where to move unless they're boomeranging back to a place they used to be in, either went to school there or grew up there, or maybe worked there previously. And that is a component of it. But there's also a lot of people that are interested in making a move, perhaps to a place they haven't lived before, and they really don't know what the opportunities are in those cities. And the companies in those cities that are growing fast and need talent don't necessarily know how to connect to the people who might now be looking for to make a move. And that was what the Rise of Rest, Tech Talent Tour is all about, trying to build a bridge, educate people about what's happening in different cities, and educate people about specific opportunities with specific companies, and connect those companies growing fast to the people that might be interested in taking the leap and really trying to make a move right now.
How do you see that affecting the efforts to make the industry more diverse and more inclusive, since there is new opportunity to not necessarily have to move to Silicon Valley to have a top job at a top tech firm?
Well, the cities we visited, many of the cities are really quite diverse, just based on the nature of the cities themselves. And so a lot of those cities are saying this is an opportunity not just to build a strong startup community, but a more inclusive startup community. Actually position the cities as being one of the most inclusive cities for entrepreneurs in the country, which then will allow them to keep more of the people who are there already, and allow them to benefit from either people boomeranging back or people deciding to go there for the first time. And so I think it's a big opportunity to create a more inclusive entrepreneurship. As we've talked about in the past, the data around venture capital is sobering in terms of place. 75% of venture capital dollars go to just 3 states. Even more sobering, frankly, more troubling, if you look at people. Even though women are 50% of our population, they get less than 10% of venture capital. Black Americans are 13% of our population, get less than 1% of venture capital. So this idea of leveling the playing field so everybody everywhere really has a shot at the American dream it couldn't be more important now than it's ever been. And this is an opportunity to really seize that, and not just have some of the big companies opening up offices in other places, but new companies emerging, and the faces of those new companies being much more diverse.
Do you see this phenomenon that we're talking about now, and what we're seeing or developing over the next couple of years? How do you see it changing the way cities approach their economic development plans?
Well, we've talked about this in the past, but when Amazon did their second headquarters effort several years ago, I think 230 cities applied. In some ways, it was frustrating to watch because a lot of those cities didn't really have a real shot. But the reality is all those cities really focused on how do they become a stronger tech city? How do they become a stronger startup city? That drove a lot of collaboration within each city, with the mayors and the governors and the university presidents and the CEOs of the big companies, as well as the entrepreneurs. And that effort is really carried forward in most of those cities, and it's been encouraging to see. And it comes back to this issue of historically, when people in politics were thinking of economic development, they were thinking of getting existing companies to move or create a new office. Now they recognize the future really is in new companies. And so how do you create a more fertile startup ecosystem that attracts and keeps talent and attracts capital, so these businesses really can start and scale in those cities? It's a big mind shift in terms of how people think about economic development. That was building pre-pandemic, but has accelerated because of the pandemic.
And so there's more opportunity for the micro talent, as someone coined in the panel the previous panel in this series, of people coming with jobs to a town where the city isn't necessarily based. And maybe they might decide, hey, I'm here in this great city with some needs, and I see a demand and I see an opening, and I'm going to start my own company here, and could actually drive entrepreneurship in a different way with a different clustering of talent that we hadn't thought about.
Exactly. I think for a lot of people, the first step will be saying, I want to stay working with a company I'm working with. I like that company. I feel comfortable with that company. There's some value to the continuity of that company and the salary and so forth. But I'm going to move and work someplace else, either permanently as a remote worker or maybe move a little further away from the headquarters to kind of Exeter. Maybe it's a couple hours away, which you wouldn't want to commute every day with that kind of distance, but maybe doing it once a week or a few times a month, it works. Once people do that, I think the second order effect will be some of those people will decide to leave that big company and join a small company or maybe start a startup of their own, which is why this can be such a profound impact if you fast forward over the next decade or so.
Great. Steve, thank you so much for joining and for a great conversation.
Thank you, Kim.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that conversation, and a major thank you again to Kim Hart for joining us again for the Rise of Remote series, and to Steve Case and his wonderful team at Revolution and Rise of the Rest as well. So at this time, I'm going to ask our panelists to turn their cameras on and to join us, and I will hand it over to Adam Ozimek. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Melika, and thanks to all the panelists for coming and everyone for attending. Really excited for this discussion. We have a variety of experts from differing perspectives here to talk about dynamism. And I think this topic is really important because dynamism has been declining for decades. And the big question now is, what's the impact that remote work is going to have on this? To start, let's talk a little bit about how remote work has affected three different kinds of businesses: small businesses, big businesses, and startups. So for small businesses, I want to go to Chris first. Chris, you've done surveys in post-pandemic of small businesses and how they're coping with remote work. Can you tell us what you've been learning so far?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. In a series of surveys that I've conducted with a variety of co-authors using a network from Alignable, which is a social network for small business owners, we have been able to trace out what small business owners have done over the course of the pandemic. And one of the things that we've focused on is their ability to transition to remote work. And so right at the beginning of the pandemic, we asked folks about productivity when working remotely, their ability to transition to remote work. And then we've been able to trace that forward over the course of the pandemic. And some of these findings are quite striking. So at the beginning of the pandemic, 30% of respondents reported that remote work made them more productive. But that means, of course, that 70% reported that remote work had no effect on productivity or a negative effect. And if we fast forward a year later, when we resurveyed the same group of people, and we could trace responses back to the same set of respondents from earlier on, that ratio had flipped. 70% said that they were more productive in remote environments. And what seems fascinating about that is that if you had told people early in the pandemic that they had the option of going back to the office, most of those respondents would have taken it. But a little bit of experience with remote work does suggest that people sort of adapt and learn how to do it, and then have realized some productivity gains as a result of being able to adopt this new technology. So I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about issues around geography and issues around what this is going to sort of mean for the small business ecosystem, because many small businesses are located in places where labor markets might be a little bit thin. And remote does quite a lot to just open the world to people who wouldn't have had access to global talent previously.
That's very interesting. I've seen the same things in my surveys as well, that productivity has gotten better over time. Remote work has gotten better for small businesses over time. I think it's fascinating because, people ask workers and they sort of say the same thing, but you could maybe be a little skeptical and say, well, maybe workers are being self-serving. But the fact that the business owners and the managers see productivity going up is pretty interesting. Gretta, what are you seeing at the big corporations that you tend to study, the Fortune 500s? How are they dealing with remote work? How is that going for them so far?
Absolutely. Yeah, remote work has really affected large firms. And, I work at the University of Oxford. I think that would count as one large firm, but also we can think of corporations like the Fortune 500. And perhaps let me start by giving a bit of context about how hiring is organized in large firms, something we don't often think about. So in US firms, full-time hiring usually goes through HR, whereas the hiring of contractors or freelancers often goes through procurement. And of course, the pandemic has equally affected the two and made remote work the new normal. But it is now post-pandemic that many firms are discussing a possible return to work and what the work models of the future will look like. And many companies, as Chris mentioned, have realized that letting their employees work remote did not impact their revenue as they expected. Sometimes they even increased it. And hence, many are considering work models that do give their full-time employees more freedom in deciding where and when they want to conduct their work, either at the home or at the office. But when we turn to what we call contingent or freelance work, it gets more interesting. And usually large firms like the Fortune 500 work with a portfolio of vendors, traditional vendors such as temporary staffing agencies, IT outsourcing vendors, marketing and design agencies, and novel ones such as online labor platforms like Upwork, Fiverr, Freelancer, etc. And with the online labor index, we measure organizational demand for what we call online platform work. And it has grown consistently since we started measuring in 2016. And the pandemic did not affect that. The growth continues to happen. However, because of how platforms have set up their API, their utilization by large firms is not always visible for us to measure. But as I've been thinking about this, I suspect that it is here where a lot of firms are evaluating their pre-pandemic contingent work models and preferred vendors to also include intermediaries that enable contractors to work remote.
It's a really interesting point that whether you're talking about remote freelancers or remote workers, it can be tough to sort of just take your existing business organization and sort of plug them in. That to really take advantage of it, to really take advantage of the freelance platforms as well, you need to make organizational changes sometimes. And I think the same thing is true of remote work as well. And that's one of the reasons why I find it interesting to think about the effect on startups. And I'm glad we have you here to talk about this, Kim-Mai, to bring the VC perspective here. Because if these big companies can't adapt as easy, you might think that startups who can, they can be created a remote first from the beginning, or at least like as their company's growing, they can sort of think about remote immediately versus putting new structures onto sort of a legacy company. So what are you seeing with startups and remote work? How are they adapting? How are they changing?
Yeah, so for a lot of our high growth companies that have seen a lot of traction over the last year, I mean, their position has basically effectively forced them into a situation where they've had to hire from all over the country. And in some cases, it's like the majority of their team has been hired in the last year, and they're only starting to meet each other in person, perhaps now. And once you kind of take that genie out of the bottle, it's really hard to put that back in, because people's expectations are that they, can work from, wherever they were hired on to, unless you specified in the hiring process that, that role is tied to a future specific location, which some companies have done. I definitely think some founders do look at it as a recruiting advantage to be open to remote relative to some of the bigger companies that, are still figuring out their hybrid or office strategies at this point. But, as all of this is in play right now. I mean, we don't know long-term, 2 or 3 years down the line, what teams look like and how productive or collaborative or collegial they are, remote versus in person, once you've just had a true A/B test, let's say. From our perspective as venture investors, we definitely think, pre-product market fit, it's appropriate for a team to try and co-locate more, just because when you don't know what you're building yet or who you're building for, there's a lot of miscommunication and misalignment that can happen from that. But once you're post-product market fit and your roles and growth and expectations and responsibilities are more defined and it's more clear what the business is doing, there's much more flexibility to have a distributed team.
That's really interesting. So it's, the early stage where they need to be sort of more in person and when they're feeling out what their company is and what they're doing. But so are you saying like it's the growth? Is it when they're like a mature company or is it when they're a scaling company?
Yeah, when they're more mature and there's more of a playbook for, hiring, a marketing team or an engineering team, or I mean, there's and you know who the customers are, what your customer personas are, the core functions of the product, then I think it's easier to have, a remote team.
So, Joe, you're a rare bird. You're an economist and an entrepreneur, PhD economist, and started your own company, collage.com. Now, you created that company remote first from the very beginning. So that's sort of a slightly different perspective than waiting till you're mature. Can you tell us a little bit about what the most important advice you would give to other companies adapting this way of work, and how did you manage to overcome those challenges that Kim-Mai suggested that other startups have when they're, when you really need to get together in person at first when you're just getting started?
These are great questions. So for us, Collage started originally just as a project between a friend of mine and myself. So it started a bit haphazardly and only evolved into a company over time. But I think by keeping it small and growing it out of something that we were just doing it for fun, really helped us get it going from the start. But in the early days, there were more challenges with remote work that have changed a lot now that the tools have gotten better. And especially in the last year or so, people have gotten a lot more used to it and experienced working remotely. In terms of advice, I'd say first people should really think a lot about if remote work is really a good fit for them, as it comes with a lot of different bundled trade-offs of both upsides and downsides compared to working in an office, especially now that people have experience with it now. Looking back on that experience, I think could help a lot of founders decide, is that really what they want to do with the company they're designing? You should also think about, is it a good strategic fit for the team and for the type of industry you're in? Alternatives also include the hybrid model that a lot of companies are moving towards, where people are in the office 2 to 3 days a week or something like that, as an alternative. One suggestion too I'd give is if some people are fully remote, but others aren't, this is a different type of hybrid model that has been around for longer. And I've interviewed a lot of job candidates who've fled that model, because if you're remote and other people are in the office, the common story is that you're missing out on opportunities for promotion and advancement, and the sort of in-person culture leaves you behind. So my broad suggestion for that type of organization is to make the culture remote work, make all meetings, for example, video calls, even if most of the people or even all will be in the office, so that people get used to that. Even still, it's a tough thing to pull off given the cultural challenges of some people really just are away and others aren't. I'd say that also stems to the recruiting. I think kind of people's preferences and tastes for remote work are such a big factor in its success. And so I found that asking job candidates a lot about their experiences and views towards remote work, as well as giving and receiving feedback, were essential. With less face-to-face communication, the further challenges integrating people into a team at first. And so there are a lot of difficulties if people aren't really interested in providing and receiving feedback, since there aren't as many face-to-face interactions to smooth things over at times. I guess the last thing I'd say is to really take the most advantage you can of the flexibility remote work provides. You can do more asynchronous work. People don't need to meet up at the same hours as much. You can hire around the country and even around the world. So your access to an expanded talent pool makes it worthwhile. At least it did very much for us, since we started remote somewhat haphazardly. We deliberately chose to remain remote through the duration of the company, primarily because of the advantages it provided us in hiring.
Really great points there. I think that last point is especially powerful. If you're going to undergo the sort of organizational form of remote, if you're going to make, take on the challenges and form a culture around that, you should really take advantage of the full benefits that allows you to really expand your labor market, versus just like, oh, we're going to go remote and then we'll all just live in the same city, or we'll still hire in the same city. The other thing you mentioned I thought was really interesting was, when you're growing remote, you can ask people, do you want to work for a remote company? And that's one of the ways that I think that, the transition we're seeing now to remote is going to advantage startups, because, a company with a large legacy workforce has to deal with this. It's not right for some people, and other people love it. And so what do you do when you have that sort of divide in your workforce, versus if you're starting a new company, a new startup, you can have those organizational decisions that Gretta mentioned around hiring. You can embrace them from the start, so your company is structured to work this way. And then B, you can make sure when you hire people that they want to work this way, versus having to deal with a staff that's divided over it. So I guess with all this in mind, all the advantages and the challenges and the differences here, I want to ask the group, and we'll start with Kim-Mai on this, but I want to ask everyone who might be interested. Then, given everything we've discussed and everything else, is the growth of remote work temporary or permanent, and how do we know that now?
I mean, I would say just from what we're seeing, it's definitely permanent. But we can see several trends happening at the same time. Like we're in another company that is in commercial real estate brokerage in SF, and we're seeing all evidence of a normal a rebound in people in companies returning to the office as well. So you're kind of getting a mix of, you're getting companies that are having like more space for remote workers and more accepting of that, but you're also seeing companies making renewed commitments to office space. And I think there's just going to be a messy period for the next couple of years where companies figure out, does hybrid work? Under what conditions does it work? I mean, there's a lot of expectations around it, but I think that there will be, the Sana CEO, Dustin Moskovitz, posted like a chart the other week about like the trough of disillusionment that is going to come and hit upon us in the next year or so, where we realize, some things that just don't functionally work. Like when you have, a meeting where some folks are on the camera, but some folks are in the room, and then like the spacing and size of faces and people's heads and voices just aren't really aligned with how like a natural and fluid feeling meeting should feel. So that's definitely, those are things we're all going to have to grapple with. But I mean, going forward, like, I do think that, this is going to be, the possibility that even like a small double-digit share, or, small to medium double-digit share of white collar workers are going to be remote, is going to be incredibly transformative, politically and economically, in ways that we can't anticipate. I think there was a story in the Times yesterday about the impact on housing markets, and like a lot of the stress that we've seen over the last 10 years in, the coastal superstar city markets. This is going to distribute the constituency that is feeling really acute stresses of affordability more geographically throughout the rest of the country. So like a lot of, smaller cities that weren't feeling the same kinds of stresses that, say, the Bay Area was, are now going to feel them. And politically, what that means for, say, the tech industry is that we're not going to I would say the constituency for tech effectively gerrymandered itself into a handful of congressional districts over the last, several decades, because they were just concentrated in, a certain subset of cities. And now you're going to see knowledge workers dispersed through lots of congressional districts throughout the country. And I'm not sure, I can't begin to think of what the ramifications of that are going to be.
It's a really important point you make, that, even if we're talking about 10, 15, 20% of the white collar workforce, you might say, well, that means most people went back to the office. But even if that's the percentage we're talking about, those are massively transformative percentages of the workforce going remote. I think that's a really important perspective. So Chris, I want to turn to you for a moment here. You've done a lot of work pre-pandemic on digital labor markets, as you call them. Upwork's one example of these, and over the last year, we've seen a ton of growth, and I know a lot of other platforms have seen growth too. So can you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, how do these markets affect firms and workers? And importantly, is this something that's pro-dynamism?
So that's a great question. And before I get into that, I just want to reflect on some of this prior conversation around remote and housing markets and reallocation, because I think it's a really important point. And there's, I think, one major uncertainty on that question, around that question for me, which is the extent that we'll see hybrid or not, because hybrid kind of changes whether we'll get reallocation out of core cities like San Francisco with people moving. And to Joe's point, and I put something in the chat, I wrote a case about Joe and Collage, and the examples where I've seen people actually work with through hybrid, where there was the option some people could be in person, haven't exactly worked out so well. And so I think that we're in a really interesting period of time where the in-person option was kind of cut out from people. And so that's why I think there's so much uncertainty about the path forward for how persistent this is going to be, or what kind of model ultimately wins out. Now, that being, sorry, I had to get that in, and I'm sorry to break the flow, Adam. On your question about dynamism and digital labor markets, I think that the question about dynamism is one that is really hard to answer from a research perspective, because there are very few natural experiments where, a market like Upwork became available to some firms or to some workers and not others, because these are really universal technologies. But the fact that they're universal technologies, I think, provides some theoretical basis for why they might contribute to dynamism. And that is, they're sort of focal points for trade to happen. And most of the folks who you would think about as selling services are trying to buy services. So you might take, for example, Joe's company, Collage, and if they needed a marketing agency, if they weren't a remote first company, they probably would have found a marketing agency in Michigan where Joe and Kevin were co-located. And that might have given them 3 or 4 marketing agencies to choose from in the Ann Arbor area. And now, as a result of having digital labor markets, you could literally find hundreds to thousands to maybe potentially hundreds of thousands of marketing agencies on platforms like Upwork or Freelancer or TopTal. And so as a result, just the availability of matching with new sources of talent is likely to drive dynamism on the firm side. And your work, Adam, in particular, that has recently looked at business registrations, especially for small businesses, suggests that this is true on the worker side, that you're seeing registrations show up with profiles on Upwork or similar markets, where people now are able to market their services in a way that you don't have to go door to door. You don't have to take out an ad in the yellow pages. You don't have to pay fixed costs to get your services out there. There's sort of a standardized way that you transact on these markets through feedback and reputation mechanisms that really lowers the barriers to entry. And so as a result, that probably also increases service quality because there's more competition, and the providers in these markets tend to need to play into some long run reputational equilibrium where they maintain high quality to make sure that the future value of their services and the earnings from those services can be captured. And so some of my early work actually sort of looks at these reputational dynamics, how to break into these markets, and what the implications are. I think that there's one other piece of the dynamism puzzle, which is what would happen in the absence of these markets, especially for sort of incumbent firms like Gretta tends to study. And I think that the answer to that question, at least from some survey evidence and from some evidence looking at alternatives to using these markets, suggests that a lot of the work that these markets facilitate just wouldn't get done in their absence. That these markets really tend to facilitate very, very specific tasks that many of the respondents in both surveys and that you can kind of infer from observational data likely wouldn't have undertaken in the absence of these types of transactions being available. And so it does look like markets like Upwork, at least in my estimation, expand the set of economic opportunities that would be occurring relative to the counterfactual situation where these markets didn't exist or existed in a much more like limited type of form. And so as a result, I think this is a big driver of dynamism. The puzzle that I have really struggled with over time is why we haven't seen these markets get bigger. And I think that probably sort of speaks to some of the stuff that Gretta has worked on in terms of organizational frictions to adoption. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think that all really great thoughts are. I think, you have organizational frictions to adoption. The same question could be asked, of course, about remote work before 2020, which is like, we're seeing now all these firms say it increases our productivity, it expands our access of hiring, all these different advantages. And like we've all said here, not everyone is going to continue to work this way, but obviously a lot of companies are. And so like, and this is a theme throughout, I think, a lot of your work, Chris, is the importance of learning by doing here. And it's been a year of learning by doing, and that's really pushed people in the remote direction. And I think what we're hearing is a lot of people are, once you take that step, once you've learned that remote works, it's an important step of learning by doing that brings you closer to, the use of remote freelancing, because it removes one of those major barriers. We used to hear at Upwork, our salespeople talk to clients who would say, the platform makes sense for us, but we don't really work remote. And, obviously that was before 2020. And now that people don't really say that anymore, it's removed a huge hurdle. Gretta, I want to ask you a little bit about this, because you talk to a lot of, executives and managers at Fortune 500 companies, big corporations. Have you seen that the growth of remote work has led to the growth of, what Chris calls digital labor markets?
I agree with Chris. This is a question that is hard to answer because it's hard to measure, as many companies keep their use of these platforms a secret. So definitely we need them to open up and talk to us so we have some more longitudinal data there. But let me start with the value proposition of digital labor platforms to large firms. It lies in affording them more flexibility to hire the best talent in the world, to hire on demand, and regardless of the availability of the talent and their skills in the local labor market. And this value proposition is what drives adoption. And it continues to drive adoption. And so we see the adoption of online labor platforms, but more recently, we're also observing a trend where large firms are creating their own internal online labor platforms to bring in remote talent. That's a phenomenon that also deserves attention, and seeing like how the value of both, how to mix and match there. So in terms of the growth, well, I teach at several executive degree programs at State Business School here at Oxford, and perhaps it's a bit, it's not a concrete research data, but I always start my lecture with a poll to ask who has experience working with contractors, who has experience with contractors hired through intermediaries, such as a staffing agency, and who has hired them through a platform. And pre-pandemic, it was usually only a handful of people in the classroom that had some sort of experience, maybe they hired someone on Fiverr to make a design for them. But here, it's about 25 to 30% of the classroom of these people doing these executive programs that have used the platform. And usually there are always 2 or 3 experts in the room. So I continue to do this, and I see it kind of, perhaps a quick measure of, how well known are these platforms and where is their use case. And in my research, focusing particularly on large firms, adoption by large firms, I found that one thing really affects organizational demand, and how I think it's likely to gonna develop, is where the platform enters the organization. And, we can broadly distinguish between centralized adoption and localized adoption. And, the first one being through procurement, as I already talked about, but the other one being in a local line department, such as, an IT department or an internal marketing agency. Bear in mind, often these companies are about 10,000 plus employees, so that they are really substantial. So then we can also make a distinction between direct adoption and indirect. And with direct adoption, the company directly interfaces with platform, for instance, with Upwork, perhaps even using its website, but the interface is one-to-one. It's a business-to-business interface. But what we now also see is some sort of indirect adoption where new sorts of intermediaries are stepping in to help companies adopt. For instance, one of the companies that's doing in this space is, for instance, Fulcrum. And there are pros and cons for each of these adoption models. For instance, in terms of the changes to existing organizational processes that I talked about for contractor hiring, but it also impacts the value proposition that platforms provide organizations. For instance, for engaging skilled contractors and versus using one of their existing continuous workforce providers. So I think it's very important for companies to think, okay, what adoption model works best for me? And think like, okay, where is the demand needed? And I agree what we discussed about. It's often work that they are unable to get done in another way where the value lies. To have so skills are unavailable. They're not available in the organization. They're not available in the local labor market. But on a platform such as Upwork, which is global, those skills might be available. It might also be that you only need them for a short period of time or really urgently, and your existing providers can't help you out there. So that's often where the journey starts. And from there, it's a learning trajectory to see like where these platforms work best for them. And that's where what we wrote about in the platform sourcing report we published in 2017. And I do think, even though we're in 2021, a lot of companies are still on that journey of figuring out where to adopt, and how to derive the best value.
Yeah, that's really important. The accessing the rare skills or the skills outside of your labor market is sort of a first step for a lot of businesses because that's so important. It really brings up a topic that I think is crucial here, which is the slowdown in dynamism in the United States has been more concentrated in places that are demographically struggling. This is something that I found in work I did with the good folks at EIG here a few years ago. And it really raises an important question about the impact of remote work, which is it going to make it easier to create a startup outside of the top superstar cities? Is it going to help spread dynamism throughout the country? Kim-Mai, I want to start with you. Has the geography of venture capital changed over the past decade, and has it changed over the pandemic in a way that makes it easier to invest in startups in the heartland?
Our portfolio has become more geographically diverse over the last 10 years. In the first two funds, we were invested in, probably 2/3 to 75% Bay Area companies. I would say like the peak of the Bay Area, the most recent Bay Area wave was probably the 2009 through 2014 period where real estate costs were relatively cheap because like the economy was still recovering. And then after about 5 years ago, we started to see more geographic dispersion. That said, most of those companies are still located in major cities. So when we look at where our companies are located, it's all the places you would think of. It's New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, Austin. And, there might be a couple in there like in Chattanooga. But, for the most part, it's still concentrated in major metros. I think the big thing that I think realistically what would end up happening is like companies are still going to get headquartered in some of these other cities, but they might have talent like mid-career engineers that might be located somewhere else. So that might be located in more rural areas. And I think it's up to one of the lessons that's been clear from the last cycle is that even if you have white collar workers located in a metropolitan region, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are linkages between those workers and, say, service workers or blue collar workers. And I think that there was a huge amount of stratification here in the Bay Area and that was really hard to bridge, frankly. And I don't know whether other smaller cities or rural areas will be able to handle that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think a lot of it has to do with housing markets, because there's definitely an advantage to having skilled workers who locate in your city. It creates spillovers in the economy. But if you're not building houses, if you're letting house prices rise rapidly, that can erode those gains for low skilled workers. So I think it's a very important point you make, that especially if cities in the Midwest, obviously there are a lot of them with tons of vacancies and lots of space to build, where that's going to be less of a risk. But for those that are still have low vacancies, they can't just say we're going to have skilled workers come in and that's the end of it. They've got to build too, or else we're just going to end up not just exporting skilled workers out of San Francisco, we're going to end up exporting bad housing markets out of San Francisco too. So it's I think that's a really great point. Joe, I want to ask you from the perspective of an entrepreneur, could we plop you anywhere in the country and you could start a business? How do you think about how remote work and remote entrepreneurship it expands dynamism into the heartland? Can we send you to Dayton and have you start a company there?
Yeah, I think it would be in a lot of ways, a lot easier now than a decade ago. Now that people, especially now, even compared to 2 years ago, now that people are much more used to remote work, and we've had many years, I'd say, progress in remote work tools within about the last year, as compared to the previous several. So I think the tools and the people are there to make it easier. I think the challenge will be there are a lot more companies that have started that are remote, and a lot of larger companies are either accommodating it or embracing it, or some sort of combination of the two. So it's not 100% clear to me, in starting a new startup, would it be easier or harder to find remote workers, since there are countervailing factors on both the supply and demand side of that part of the labor market. But my guess would be that it'd still be easier because of some of the challenges, including ones that you were talking about, of larger companies having difficulty adapting to remote work, and the overall challenge of the more like legacy policies and processes, and having a mix of people who at the end of the day do and don't really want remote work. And I think it'll take some time for people who aren't interested in remote work to sort out of companies that are now embracing it more. So I think you just sidestep all that, and starting a new startup now fully remotely can start fresh, and you can start your culture to really embrace post-pandemic fully remote practices. And I think clever startups will still have plenty of ways to stand out on the remote labor market. The challenges might just be a little bit different than before the pandemic. But I think the opportunity is probably bigger, because you'd have just a much larger pool of remote interested workers to potentially recruit.
Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely sounds pro dynamism for sure. So I want to open this one up to anyone who wants to take it, and we can hear from multiple people on this. But if we're looking about the future of dynamism, we're in multiple decades of declining dynamism, and over the Great Recession, we did see an increase in new business not the Great Recession, over the pandemic recession, we saw an increase of new business formation, which is kind of an optimistic note. And a lot of the discussion we're having here, I think, can bring some optimism too. But it's a lot to be leaning against a 30-year decline of dynamism. So I'm just curious if anyone wants to weigh in, whether on net, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of dynamism? I'm going to call on one of you if we don't get a volunteer.
I can have a go. I'm an optimist, so I vote for optimism here. Not only thinking about the US, but worldwide. There lies a lot of promise in technology, and companies have figured out how to run their operations remote. So that's a big plus, because previously they had hesitations about it. And it was mostly triggered by fears that their revenue would be compromised if they would enable their employees more freedom. And we now have the proof that that's not always the case. And the platforms that are out there, the new sorts of intermediaries there, and the skills that are available is really a competitive advantage for a lot of companies. So if you enable remote, suddenly your potential to drive value, not only in cutting costs, but also in terms of bringing in knowledge, driving innovation, there's a huge potential there. So we spoke about the organizational side. What we need to focus on is the worker side. Does it drive the classic urban rural divide? Does it help solve those issues? And yeah, perhaps here I can plug in some of the research of my colleagues at Oxford that have studied this using transaction data of one of the major platforms and linking that with regional data from the US Census Bureau. And they did indeed find that rural counties make disproportionate use of the online labor market. So that's a major finding, and this was pre-pandemic. So we should do this study again and see what happened during the pandemic to see if this actually increased. There is a bit of a connotation there in that the most rural areas actually they don't make use of these digital labor platforms. And perhaps a simple explanation is access to digital infrastructure, which is a key essential requirement that is needed, an investment that has to be made to open it up. Another connotation that needs to be made is, okay, these workers, they work out of the countryside, but did they live there prior to finding work through a platform? Or did they live in one of the rural areas? For instance, they studied there, built up the capital and the work relations. And once that was all solidified, then they felt confident they could move back. This is what we've seen in the pandemic for a lot of workers, even in full-time employment, that when their employers were confident, they said, okay, now I'm going to buy that house close to my family. So I do see that trend will continue, and not only for full-time employees, I also think that will be a trend for contractors. We do have to consider, one, the digital infrastructure component. Really big investments have to be made there, so we don't have that inequality there, because that's driving major inequalities, not only in work, but also in education. And perhaps that then brings me to the second point, is that it can help overcome the educational part, because the digital online work, the big future is in skilled work and having that specialized expertise. And we have to think about how you can develop that when you're not in a center, when you're perhaps not, you don't have the access to key universities such as Stanford, and really opening up, online learning, online education, and giving people access there.
I think those are really great points, Greta. Great notes to close on. I think it sounds like we've got a lot of reasons to be optimistic about the potential for dynamism to increase as a result of remote work and remote work platforms. But policymakers can't just sit back and wash their hands and assume the job is done. We continue to need housing market reform, as Kim-Mai noted. We need broadband access in most rural places that don't seem to be benefiting from access to these jobs yet. And these platforms especially open up huge skilled work opportunities for people to work in niches and specializations that they might not have had access to, but they still need ways to get that education and ways to get those skills. So with that, I'll turn it over to Milika for final thoughts there, and just wanted to thank the panel for joining, and thank everyone in the audience for joining as well.
Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you so much to Upwork for working with EIG on this Rise of Remote series. We certainly appreciate all of the time that the panelists have contributed, and both for this panel and for our previous two panels. We are super grateful for that. As I mentioned earlier, you can watch the first 2 sessions on EIG's website, and the recording for this session will be made available on our website shortly as well. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists and moderators. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.